Our speaker is Jason Williams, who's a research hydrologist with the Southwest Watershed Research Center in Tucson. That's part of the USDA's ARS. His current research emphasizes eco-hydrologic feedbacks between soils, vegetation, and the atmosphere, with particular focus on the effects of disturbances in conservation restoration practices on vegetation, soils, and hydrologic and erosional processes. The title of his talk today is Eco-Hydrologic Impacts of Conservation Practices and Disturbances on Western Rangelands.
Well, thanks for the introduction, and thanks for sticking around for the last talk of the day on the convoluted ways in which water moves downhill. So I probably should have maybe tweaked my title a little bit. We'll be looking at the eco-hydrologic impacts of conservation practices on Western rangelands, but really more of an emphasis on sagebrush rangelands and pinyon juniper woodlands. This work is, what I'll show you is really based on some experimental research over the last 10 years. There are a number of collaborators you can see listed here at the bottom of the slide. And this work was funded through USDA and through Joint Fire Science, National Interagency Fire Center, and the Bureau of Land Management. So we'll start just with an overview here of kind of a roadmap for the talk. The talk's a little bit dense. I'm trying to accomplish several things. One, talk a little bit about a framework for how to look at the hydrologic impacts of conservation practices. And by hydrologic impacts, I'm talking more about superficial processes, so overland flow, infiltration, and erosion processes. So we'll start off with a little bit of an overview on that. And then we'll talk a little bit about disturbances. So fire is an abrupt disturbance agent, and then woodland encroachment is more of a prolonged disturbance. And then we'll look a little bit more at some land management treatments that are applied in woodlands or sagebrush sites that have been converted to woodlands, trying to restore sagebrush vegetation to those systems and how the hydrology and the vegetation respond. And then we'll talk a little bit about model applications and wrap up. So this is kind of where we'll start and try to create a framework that will follow the rest of the way through the talk. And for most of us that have been out on rangelands here in the Great Basin and elsewhere, we know these are very patchy landscapes. You can see the figure in the upper left there from Pearson et al. 1994 that sort of depicts that a little bit. It shows this coppice mound. You could think of that as being like a shrub mound. And then adjacent to that, there are these interspaces that will either be vegetated or bare. And most of the runoff and erosion that we see on rangelands that are well vegetated, like this photograph on the upper right, occurs in those bare interspaces. And that's by rain splash and sheet flow processes. And these are very inefficient processes at moving sediment down the slope. And for these well vegetated systems like what you see here, that water and sediment tends to move just a limited distance before it's captured in a vegetated patch. But of course, as vegetation coarsens either through degradation or over land use or some disturbance agent, like you see in the photographs in the middle there, overland flow, as it forms in these bare patches, those patches start to become more and more connected, and overland flow, of course, does as well. And as it moves down the slope, as you can see in the photographs, it tends to move down with a greater velocity, which gives it more energy to detach and transport sediment. And of course, that's what we see as these systems become more well connected in bare ground in these interspace patches. And there's another image on the left there indicated with the B. That's depicting from Parsons et al. There, depicting the conversion of grasslands to shrublands that's occurred throughout much of the desert Southwest. And there's a photograph in the bottom left that shows sort of how water routes around those shrub mounds and in those sort of coarse textured hollows between the shrubs. And that's sort of what we see on rangelands in general. And then the photograph on the bottom left is a pinyon juniper woodland. This would have been a sagebrush site that's been converted to a PJ woodland. And you can see the amount of bare ground there is in the understory associated with competition of the trees with sagebrush and the herbaceous cover. And so as these systems sort of shift from well vegetated to this more sparse condition, concentrated overland flow becomes the dominant runoff and erosion process. And again, it's a more efficient mechanism at moving sediment down the slope. And so rangelands typically exist either on one of these ends of the spectrum, resource conserving or non-conserving, or somewhere in between. And there was a nice framework, the Trigger Transfer Reserve Pulse, or the TTRP framework that was put forth by Ludwig et al. In 2005 in Ecology, that nicely sort of depicts that rainstorms are these triggering events that result in either runoff or runon for these coarsely vegetated systems like those in the bottom left there. That triggering event generates runoff that moves off-site and it taking with it valuable soils. But for these well-vegetated systems, that the sediment and the water are trapped immediately downslope, and that infuses a pulse of growth into these vegetated patches, and then it's sort of this self-reinforcing system. And so we'll kind of follow this structure and function framework as we look at conservation practices. Some examples from the research I've done over the last 10 years with some of my collaborators. And we'll start first with fire here as an abrupt disturbance. And you don't really have to be a hydrologist to look at the figure in the upper left and take some guess that runoff and erosion would increase relative to an unburned condition, but that's a burned sagebrush rangeland in southwestern Idaho. Of course, fire creates these more uniform bare conditions, so we're increasing the spatial connectivity of bare soil, and then as runoff accumulates in space, you can see. Let's see if this is. You can see here in the middle, there's pretty consistent ponding in this rainfall simulation experiment, and as that water starts to accumulate, it forms concentrated flow, as I talked about in the previous slide. And then you can see this burned tree plot in the bottom left here, and I've sort of colored in where the rills occurred there. And so fire is essentially creating more uniform conditions. It's allowing overland flow to be uniformly connected and form concentrated flow paths. And then, of course, there's readily available sediment here after removing the litter. So again, we're just increasing the continuity, the structure, and the connectivity of processes. We can look at some data to see how that plays out. This is concentrated overland flow velocity from some overland flow experiments and versus percent bare ground. And in the black here, these are the unburned plots in these experiments, and then the red are the burned plots. And so you can just get an idea there of the relationship of bare ground to overland flow velocity that just illustrates what I'm talking about and what we see in the photographs. This graph here shows erodibility. So this is kind of sediment divided by runoff. You can think of that as just an indicator of erosion versus bare ground. And again, keeping with the same symbology, we can see the effects of fire there. And then sort of the collective effects of the connectivity of processes and the increase in sediment availability is seen in this lower graph here. The green symbols and this linear feature here show sediment yield versus cumulative runoff from some rainfall simulation experiments. And then there's this exponential deviation for the burn plots. Again, for the same amount of runoff, say 50 millimeters, there's a much greater sediment yield. And that's because processes are connected. Overland flow is moving at a higher velocity. It's got a greater energy to move sediment, and there's more sediment available for transport. So that's fire as an abrupt disturbance. And we think of woodland encroachment as being more of a prolonged disturbance agent that increases runoff and erosion from rangelands. And so this is a problem that we constantly are dealing with. But if you look at this photograph on the upper left, this is a sagebrush site sort of in the early stages of woodland encroachment. The understory is still largely intact there, and we would expect that to function more as a resource conserving system. But over time and in this sort of later stage of woodland succession, you can see bare ground forms. It's extensive, and you can imagine that if you had intense rainfall in these large connected bare patches, overland flow processes will be well connected. And because one of the challenges, if you're managing these systems and trying to not only change the vegetation or keep sagebrush is when do you treat these systems? And if you're thinking about that in the context of hydrology, when's the best time to treat? There's a lot of variability along the gradient from sort of the early stages of encroachment to these later stages, and there's some decision-making criteria that have to be employed there. We'll start to look at some experiments to sort of disentangle that a little bit. So for our hydrology experiments, again, to look at sort of structural and functional connectivity on these systems, we have to break them into meaningful pieces on the landscape. And if we stay focused on this figure here to the right first, we break these up into these sort of, we call it tree coppice here, but you can think of this as just a tree microsite. These might be 10 to 20 square meters, depending upon how many trees are there. but the bulk of the landscape are these big inner canopy patches, and that's where most of the overland flow occurs. We can further subdivide the inner canopy into these interspace or shrub microsites, and these are just photographs from 2 different sites, one at the top, one at the bottom here. And these are sort of what we would refer to as our fine scale plots. So these are about a ½ square meter, and these plots are for us to be able to measure runoff and erosion by rain splash and sheet flow processes, so those sort of finer scale processes. And you can tell just looking at the figures, you would guess that these bare plots is where the major source of runoff and erosion would be for these systems, for the inner canopy areas. I've got cumulative runoff and sediment values shown in each of the photographs, and pretty clearly the highest runoff and sediment yields from rainfall simulations occur from those interspace patches. So what happens over larger spatial scales? As we start to accumulate more and more interspace over larger scales, say 10 to 20 square meters, overland flow tends to concentrate. So flow accumulates over that larger spatial scale, forms these concentrated overland flow paths or rills, again with a greater capability to move sediment down slope. And what we've seen from our work in these woodlands and in sagebrush sites, so there tends to be this threshold at about 50% bare ground. You can see this is percent bare ground here and cumulative runoff and sediment yield from rainfall simulation experiments across 3 different woodlands. But once bare ground exceeds this 50% threshold, that's where we start to see more overland flow concentrating and rills form. In fact, we've done some probability statistics on this, and the probability of overland flow to concentrate and form these rills is really based on the amount of overland flow we get, so the amount of discharge, the percent bare ground, and then the slope angle. So that gives us sort of a background, one, just to understand the structure and function, how vegetation influences hydrology or superficial processes on rangelands, and then gives us some idea of what the initial effects of fire are, and then what a prolonged disturbance like woodland encroachment does. And now we'll step through sort of short-term and long-term responses to prescribed fire and mechanical tree removal treatments. This is the same sagebrush site that I talked about earlier, where a prescribed fire was done initially to reduce tree encroachment pretty early in that process. You can see the photograph up here in the upper left, so pretty uniform bare conditions. We would expect processes to be pretty well connected there. So extensive bare soil, water repellent soils like Pete talked about in the earlier talk today, ample runoff and sediment, and rills are a very active process in this condition. You can see by year 1, there's pretty good cover recruitment on the site, so there's a lot of herbaceous cover there. However, underneath that cover, there's probably very little ground cover, so there's very little protection right at the ground surface. And so where runoff does occur, it tends to be well connected in space. And so we still have rill processes active, even though there's that much cover. And by year 2, we start to see a little bit of litter build up on the ground surface. You can see there's ample vegetation there. And you can see what the effects of the cover changes, and in year 2 actually getting some litter on the ground, what that does to the number of rills. And so by seeing that this number of rills has dropped from 5 to 0 over that 2-year period, that's telling us that the processes are starting to be disconnected by sort of creating more complexity at the ground surface. We can look at some data here to see how that plays out quantitatively. This is runoff from rainfall simulation experiments, so our runoff rate versus time, and sediment yield versus time for those same rainfall simulations. And the red line is the first year, or actually the year of the fire, and then the green line is 1 year post-fire, and the blue line is 2 years post-fire. And so you can see the difference, or the effect of the vegetation in reducing runoff, but processes are still pretty well connected, so sediment yield 1 year later is still elevated. And then by the second year, where runoff drops below the unburned condition, sediment yield is almost 0. And again, that's associated with this reduction in process connectivity and increasing the complexity of cover at the ground surface. So one of the questions then is what happens on these woodlands? So that was, that sagebrush site was in the early stages of woodland encroachment, but what happens when we treat, say, a woodland in mid to late succession with prescribed fire? What happens to the vegetation? What happens to the cover? And how does that affect the hydrology? So these are 2 woodland sites in the Great Basin. marking corral here on the left and Anarchy on the right. And you can see that for the unburned condition, you can see the connectivity of the bare ground there, and you would expect fairly high runoff and erosion rates for these sites. Prescribed fire effectively increases the spatial connectivity and the susceptibility to runoff and erosion. As you might expect, as we add all this extra bare ground through fire and there's more sediment available, runoff and erosion rates would be expected to increase. But at about 8 to 9 years post-fire, you can see that those big bare patches within the inner canopy are starting to fill in nicely with herbaceous vegetation, with bunch grasses. We're adding some complexity to the ground surface here. So we would expect that that would disrupt the connectivity of overland flow where it does occur. And so the vegetation is starting to have a feedback on the hydrology, and the hydrology should be starting to have a feedback on the vegetation as well. We can look at some data to quantitatively evaluate that. So this is runoff from rainfall simulations and cumulative sediment from those same simulations. These are on 12 to 13 square meter plots. And we're just going to focus on the data from these inner canopy areas, which we refer to as shrub interspace zones in our data. So those are circled with the green, or highlighted by the green ovals. And this is both sites in the untreated condition, and runoff is somewhere 35 to 45 millimeters. But not hanging up too much on the numbers and just looking at the change. So this is 9 years post-fire. So you can start to see that the effect of that vegetation and breaking up that or adding complexity to the ground surface and breaking up the connectivity of flow, and what that does to how much runoff is coming off of these sites. And then you can see that in reducing runoff, you can see the effect here on sediment yield. So substantial reductions in sediment yield. So, effectively, we've taken the system through applying fire here and moved it from a non-conserving rangeland to one that's more resource conserving. So that's one of the goals of the treatments. That's the kind of the upshot of prescribed fire in these systems. One of the downsides is that we do get cheatgrass here. This has been pretty commonly reported in other studies. The cheatgrass commonly infills. You can see this burned tree right here, and there's this sort of black circle around it, and that's kind of the common place where we see these increases in cheatgrass. From a hydrologic perspective, they're still functioning pretty well, but this is not the grass cover that we want to have in there. So, the positives of prescribed fire, we've got a nice bunch grass cover in here now. We've seen improved infiltration, reduced runoff and erosion from these sites. We have lost the sagebrush cover to some extent. It should be back in 30 or so years. But then there was the fire did a nice job of reducing tree cover. So we'll now step through some results from mechanical treatments. And I'll talk about some of the pros and cons of fire and mechanical treatments as we do this. So in the short term with the mechanical treatments, we didn't expect to see a big change in vegetation over the first couple of years because it's a little bit less abrupt of a disturbance as fire perhaps. And so the one way we would expect those treatments to affect hydrology is by getting some of the tree debris into the inner spaces or those bare inner canopy patches. Again, we're trying to add complexity there and break up the connectivity of processes. So just adding this tree mulch into the inner spaces, that improved infiltration by about 50% and reduced sediment discharge by about 50%. So that's a nice short-term benefit of that mechanical treatment. Another thing we looked at is the effect of cutting trees and allowing them to fall into the bare inner canopies. There's this idea that they would then trap runoff and sediment. But the initial impacts of that are pretty limited. In fact, as these trees fall over in the inner canopy, they fall over kind of like a ball, and there are these voids in contact of that tree debris with the soil surface. And overland flow tends to concentrate in those openings as it moves through the tree. And so essentially this system is functioning just like the untreated areas. So no real positives to cutting and dropping those trees in the inner canopy, at least initially. Kind of the upshot to these, the long-term effects of these treatments. You can see how these sites have changed. One of the positives relative to fire is that we retain the sagebrush cover. In fact, in both cases of these sites, we've seen increases in sagebrush cover and increases in perennial grass cover. Maybe not as substantial with the fire, but we were able to get those with this treatment without losing the sagebrush. So that's a positive effect. There's also still quite a bit of bare ground. We're around that 50% threshold that I mentioned to where rills start to form under intense rainfall. So at 8 to 9 years, or well, 9 years out for this data set, we still have almost 50% bare ground. And so we did see improvements in infiltration, but runoff and erosion rates are still statistically similar to the untreated areas. So minor improvements, but there's enough variability in the data, they're not statistically different technically. So both sites really are starting to trend towards resource conserving, but there's patience needed here for that to happen. This is one of the downsides to the mechanical treatment versus fire is although the mechanical treatment effectively removed the large trees, there are a number of these smaller trees scattered about. And I just circled the ones that were easily seen in the photograph. But as you walk around, you see there are quite a number of those. And those are going to require follow-up treatment. Otherwise, it just comes back as a woodland. So that's one of the downsides of the mechanical treatment relative to fire. Last thing on the mechanical treatment, so I said cross-felling those trees into the inner canopy had no positive effects initially, but what we see over the long term is they actually do trap water and sediment. So this is cumulative runoff and sediment values from some overland flow experiments in uncut areas and in the cut treatment area 9 years after treatment. And then this is in the cut area 9 years after treatment, but plots that have these downed trees in them. And you don't have to worry too much about the numbers, but just kind of get a grasp of the relative difference in them. So these trees are now starting to get more connected to the ground surface, and they're starting to affect hydrologic processes. And they represent about 25 to 30% of the landscape. So this is some work done by Fred Pearson and some folks with ARS in Burns, Oregon. They looked at the effects of cutting in a western juniper woodland, and they were at a 10-year window post-treatment. And you can see in their study, you can see the herbaceous response relative to the uncut woodland there. And so they had a nice herbaceous response that actually broke up the bare ground and added complexity. And at 10 years out, they actually saw pretty favorable effects on runoff. You can see the differences in the two lines here and in sediment yield. So in their case, at 10 years out, about the same window as us, they were seeing changes in hydrology. So we anticipate changes in hydrology forthcoming in the other sites I talked about. But again, it's really about knowing something about your sites and how you're going to change the structural and functional connectivity. It'll give you a better idea of how things are going to respond. So to this point, we've talked a little bit about how to think about rangelands in terms of their hydrology and how the structure of vegetation affects that. And then a little bit on conservation practices. And now I'm just going to briefly touch on a couple of tools that we use commonly to manage these landscapes and how we can kind of infuse this understanding into those tools. And one of the most commonly used tools is our ecological site descriptions. For those that don't know what ecological sites are, I've got a little description here, but it's effectively just a conceptual way to parse the landscape out based on physical attributes, so soils and climate, that will tell us a little bit about how the landscape, or what kind of vegetation and how much vegetation will be there, and then how it's going to respond to disturbances in management. And they usually have a state and transition model like what you see here, in various levels of complexity. They can be painful to look at sometimes. But basically each of these blocks represents a particular type of cover or amount of cover and how it's going to respond to management. And then there are transitions that are things that drive moving from one box to the next. And this is usually accompanied with a site narrative that explains that. And so these models are largely based around plant community dynamics, so how the vegetation is going to change. And we know with that comes changes in the structure of that cover, and we know also that affects hydrology, and that hydrology feeds back on that structure. And so one of the suggestions that we had in this paper here in 2016 were ways to infuse that kind of information into this existing model that's really looking mostly at plant community dynamics. We offered some suggestions on how to do that. If you're working with an ecological site description that doesn't include that information, there's also suggestions herein that talk about ways you can build your own version of that and marry it with the current ecological site description. So really we're just trying to suggest that you can take tools that look at structure of vegetation on rangelands and then apply what we know about how that affects hydrology to get a better idea of how management disturbances will affect hydrology and how it will feed back. We've also worked a lot on the rangeland hydrology and erosion model. There are a lot of tools out there that can help you predict how a landscape is going to respond to disturbance or management. You heard about some from the Forest Service earlier today in Pete's talk. The rangeland hydrology and erosion model here, it's available online, freely available, and you run it in an online format. This model requires very simple input. These are multiple runs here representing different conditions, but effectively you log in. If you want to create a model run, you just assign a site name and you select a climate file off of a map that's representative of the site you're working in. You put in some basic information on soil, so soil texture, some basic slope attributes such as the shape of the slope and how long it is, and then foliar cover for just a few set groups, I think. You can see those groups shown here, and then there's 4 groups of ground cover that you put in. And that's all that's really needed to run the model. And you can run the model for a single site, and let's say it's a sagebrush site that you know you want to apply prescribed fire to, and if you know something about how that cover is going to change based on other sagebrush sites you've looked at, you can build another model run that shows what you think that site's going to look like in terms of the cover, and the model will give you side-by-side output. Predictions of runoff and erosion. I've just shown the 25-year return frequency here, but the model gives you annual time steps, and then it gives you runoff and erosion estimates for different return interval events. It also has a probabilistic framework where you can establish a reference condition, and then you can see deviations from that in terms of the amount of erosion that may occur in these sort of low, medium, high, and very high categories. So the model can be used to do variations of conditions for the same site, or perhaps if you're looking at a site or multiple sites that you're considering for treatment, you could create side-by-side model runs of each of those sites, and maybe that would help you target the conservation practices if they're aimed at reduction of runoff and erosion. We provide sort of a Cliff Notes version of how to apply the model in this context in a short rangelands paper, and then the more detailed information is in this 2016 paper. So with that, we'll just kind of wrap up, and I hope one of the themes that comes out in the talk, I know is a little bit dense in terms of looking at data and figures and talking about all these different disturbances, is that the structural and functional connectivity matter. It's a very useful way to think about rangelands and how they function. Typically we're looking at vegetation, but if we understand something about hydrology, we know the vegetation drives that, and it has very important feedbacks. In the case of prescribed fire here, we know that burning increases the connectivity of runoff and erosion sources and processes, and so there's this short-term increase in the vulnerability of these systems to elevated soil loss. But over time, as cover comes back, it starts to add complexity, and that reduces the connectivity of processes and reduces runoff and erosion. And so there's different time scales on that recovery. We saw in the case of woodlands that perhaps if you treat early in the encroachment gradient where there's an established understory, maybe that recovery period window is a little bit shorter. Again, at 2 and 3 years after fire, we see improvements. Those sites aren't the same as an unburned site, so they're not fully recovered per se, but we do see shorter sort of recovery windows than for some of the later succession woodlands. For the mechanical treatments that I talked about, we see that if you want some initial impact of those treatments on hydrology, you have to sort of spread some tree debris out into the inner canopy. I know that can sort of create some horizontal continuity of fuels, so that's a consideration. And it can also affect the vegetation reestablishment. So those things should be considered as well. And then also, it's important to note that in considering the trade-offs on the prescribed fire versus mechanical treatments, these mechanical treatments take time to see the hydrologic improvements, in some cases more than 10 years. And of course, all treatments have trade-offs. We talked a little bit about the trade-offs in the mechanical treatments in woodlands where they leave those small trees that can come back and reestablish woodland conditions, but at the same time they keep the sagebrush, and we can still have good perennial bunch grass returns there and slow improvement in the hydrology. Whereas prescribed fire may yield a more rapid recruitment of the perennial bunch grasses and improvement in the hydrology. You lose the sagebrush there, but you have better tree removal perhaps with that practice. So there are always these trade-offs. And then lastly, these connectivity concepts provide a nice framework to link vegetation and hydrology processes on rangelands, and they're easily encompassed into conceptual models like ecological site descriptions or other descriptive approaches of how you sort of frame how a system works, what's there, and what the processes are that are involved. And then there are a number of quantitative models that are available to inform decision making. Some of those that Pete talked about, the rangeland hydrology and erosion model here. And lastly, although we know a lot about these systems, there's still a lot of work to be done, and there are a lot of sites that we need to build this kind of information on moving forward. And that concludes what I have. And with that, I'm happy to take questions if we have time for that.
Plenty of time for questions.
Perhaps I missed it, but I didn't hear anything about soil crust formation and the role of that in aiding erosion. Have you looked into that at all? It's the way this was presented, it looks like it's bare ground or vegetation coming back, and that seems like a very important component. So, but I may have missed that.
No, you're right. It's not in there. And much of the work that I've been doing has been in areas where soil crust weren't necessarily a critical component of protecting that soil surface. Certainly, like I now reside in Tucson, Arizona. It's a new place for me, and I'm starting to look at doing some of this work on woodlands in the Southwest, where soil crusts seem to be a much more important component of protecting that soil. Not that they're not important in the Great Basin. They just haven't been a critical component of where I've done this work. And in the discussion of RHEM, there's a place in there where you can actually populate soil crust. So we know it's an important component, and I'm certainly not an expert on soil crust and not really the best person to address that. But it is an important component, and you're right, I didn't include that in this talk.
After prescribed burns, it wasn't clear to me, is sagebrush going to return? Opinion juniper or both, or what do you think?
Yeah, well, I won't profess to be a plant community ecologist or an expert in that area. My understanding is that, well, first let's back up a little bit. What comes back and how fast it comes back depends on what was there to begin with, right? That's probably the biggest control on that. And there are recommendations by other people that are more experts in that field. More of a physical process hydrologist that dabbles a little bit in ecology than a true ecologist. But that's an important piece, what's there before you apply that treatment. And then yes, those things, the sagebrush can come back. My understanding is that's 25 to 50 years depending on what was there to begin with and what kind of site you're on. And the trees can come back too, depending on where the seed source is and how effective the fire is at removing those trees. Those things can happen as well. So yeah.
Mark?
Yeah, I was sort of following up on Paul's question about the crust. Well, you haven't really looked at the crust, you have looked at hydrophobicity.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about differences you found in terms of hydrophobic soil processes after the treatments.
Yeah. So let's see if I can go back. Well, maybe this one will serve us well enough. So we have looked a lot at hydrophobicity, not just in the woodlands, but on sagebrush sites. And it's highly variable in time and space. And we see it there before fire. So I think that's an important thing. Years ago, we didn't think about hydrophobicity until after fire. We thought fire was a driver of that. And fire does change it, and it can affect it. But at least on all the sagebrush sites we work on, and all of the woodlands, pinyon juniper woodlands I've been on, if we peel back that litter layer underneath the trees of that mineral soil surface, it's there. Those soils are hydrophobic. It's just in the unburned condition, the litter layer is, 15, 20 centimeters thick. And so that, when we do rainfall simulations on those, I don't have pictures of the unburned ones here, but, the water just fills up that storage layer there. And what we see is you get very little runoff of those plots, even though the soils are hydrophobic. You're just storing it in the litter layer and allowing time for that infiltration to occur through breaks and cracks in the hydrophobic layer. As soon as you remove that litter layer, which you can see this tree here, so the soils would have been hydrophobic underneath that tree. As soon as you remove that protective litter layer and then you rain on it, runoff occurs very rapidly. And so we have some plots where we've rained for an hour and a half on them. And anyone who's walked around on a fire, maybe after doing mop-up or something like that, you've seen this. You walk on that, if you were to walk across the surface, that wet soil sticks to your boot, whatever it is at the surface, and then underneath of it, it's like powder dry, right? And so we see that on these woodland sites around these trees. These areas in between the trees, those are all wettable. And so these become, right after fire, the primary source of runoff and sediment, even more so than these bare inner canopy patches. And it does sort of dissipate over time, and we've got a couple of papers that show that. But it is highly variable in space and time, and we're still trying to figure out how we deal with that in a modeling context. It exists in the data that go into our model, so it's there indirectly, but we're not really addressing it in a model context. But it's highly variable in space. On these woodlands, it's isolated really underneath these trees. And then when you get into a sagebrush site, most of the time from what we've seen, it's underneath the sagebrush, but it can be in the inner canopy if they're well vegetated. So it's a complex and very interesting problem that we're working on. And I would say I don't see anything consistent about it other than what I've just told you about these trees. Yes?
Would post-disturbance seeding quicken the recovery time, the hydrologic recovery time?
Well, obviously, if the seeding is successful, right? I mean, that's the real question, right? And that's not something I do, and I'm not an expert on that. As I understand it, there's lots of things you can do, and if you get the right precip that year, you're a hero, and if you don't, you're a goat, even though you may have done the same thing in both cases. But yeah, I mean, so the kinds of things I was trying to talk about is thinking about these landscapes in terms of their structural and functional connectivity. And certainly if you can get cover back here faster with seeding and it's a successful practice, and you can get something that looks like this, you're adding complexity to that slope, which is going to disrupt those processes. And that's really the whole basis of the talk, is to start thinking about these sites in terms of how they're structurally oriented and how that affects processes. So yeah, if you can have a successful treatment that fills in this here, I would think you would see improvements in infiltration. And it depends on how much cover you get back and how it's oriented and that kind of thing.
Any more questions? Okay, we're here.
Did you guys study any plots where you did chain post-burn, or what's your thoughts on that?
On chaining?
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't done any work with chaining. There's, it's potentially a different thing altogether. I mean, there's a lot more disturbance with that than the mechanical treatments that you see here that you've heard me talk about. Here, I talked a little bit about mechanical treatments in terms of cutting and mastication, and there's, it's fairly similar in terms of the effects we've seen from those. But I haven't done anything with chaining, honestly. So.
And more specifically, chaining post-burn on the skeletons and those little hydrological messes right there.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Matt Matson did some work where he looked at sort of chaining and doing some things to try to break up the hydrophobic layer. And I haven't done enough work on that really to comment on it, honestly.
Any more questions? If not, let's give Jason a big round of applause.